Today on the program, we welcome back someone who has not been with us for several years, Dr. Paul Cameron, who's the chairman of the Family Research Institute. Some of our viewers who have been following the program for some time, Dr. Cameron, may remember you as one of our most anti-gay guests that we've had. A lot of your work focused on the LGBT community in different shapes and forms. And eventually, in part two of the interview, I want to get to your more general thoughts about the incredible sort of increase in LGBT rights in the U.S. over the last many years. But before we get to that, you reached out to me a couple of weeks ago claiming that you had been proven right on a few particular LGBT predictions that you had made. Most interestingly to me, that you predicted that there would be more and more LGBT people over time. And you believe that that is the case, do you not?
I do. I didn't predict that it would happen necessarily, but I did predict that if our society, or any society, were to equate homosexuality and heterosexuality, to make heterosexuality, homosexuality as attractive, to tell its children, one way or the other, it's okay, there would be an enormous growth in homosexuality. And I think, but this I'm not sure of, that the increase in LGBT or LBGism is going to be unstoppable unless society actually does something to arrest it.
Okay, so let's first describe how you are measuring that there are more LGBT people in society. On what basis do you say that?
Well, there are actually a number of different polling organizations, Pew, Gallup, and of course, the federal government is running a number of different polls, usually under the CDC or HHS, and all of them show a dramatic increase, usually to about the same magnitude. That is, in the aggregate, about a doubling since earlier polls, not quite as sophisticated in the 80s and early 90s. So the latest iteration of a federal government poll that I think is very good is the one on drug use and so forth. And that one has something like 40-some thousand folk in it. And there's been measuring of high school students in particular. And that, of course, is the area which is the most likely to show an increase. It's the one that's most sensitive to educational and media preachments. And that shows at least a doubling.
Okay, so I don't agree with you. What I believe we are seeing is, in most polls, a slight uptick and sometimes a level number of people reporting that they are LGBT. I'll give you two data points, and of course, as I always do, you'll have plenty of time to refute them.
Sure.
If you look at Gallup numbers over the last decade, you've seen very modest increases, often within the margin of error. For example, 3.8% in 2015, up to 4.5% in 2018. That would be one data point. A second data point would be the National Survey of Family Growth, which is run by the CDC. That shows that for many surveys, all the way back to 2002, about 1.3% of respondents say that they are gay or lesbian. Number who say they are bisexual has varied a little bit over time. So I'm simply not even seeing the data you claim exists. But I think importantly, there's a really key issue here, which is there's a difference between more people reporting that they are LGBT versus more people simply being willing to tell the truth on surveys. And as stigma goes down, it would make sense that even without changing the percentage of the population that is LGBT, that more people are just comfortable saying that they are because society has to some degree destigmatized it.
That's true. That's possible. However, that would seem to indicate, or that would seem to, it would seem to indicate that what we're looking at here is, as you say, opening up. telling the truth for the first time. That strikes me as improbable because, for instance, if you look back into the 80s where we did our research and the 90s and so forth, where HIV and AIDS was very prevalent, very prevalent in the media, the statistics there are much smaller. And I would argue that we're looking at a real increase, especially with the high school stuff. Now, to be sure, how many of these high schoolers will retain what they claim? How many of them will change as they actually experience more of life and engage in sexual activity? It's possible. But I would put a lot of stake in this risk factor survey that's been done now for about 22 or 3 years.
Yeah, well, we'll get to the risk factor, but it sounds like what you're saying is you are aware of some studies which seem to show an increase in self-reported LGBT membership. I'm pointing to others which show maybe a modest increase. You're accepting that at least some fraction of that could simply be that society is less likely to punish someone for just saying honestly what it is that they feel. So it actually sounds like your case that there has been this very clear increase in the number of LGBT people is not a very strong case for someone who claims to be a researcher.
I think it's fairly strong. First of all, as you admit, just about every survey shows an increase. Most of the surveys you're referring to, I suspect, take the whole adult population. Now, I'm mainly concerned about the green edge of the population, that is, those in high school, coming out of high school, into college, and so forth. And by that basis, it looks like about a doubling. And somewhat surprisingly to me, in some respects, especially among females.
Yeah, but
especially
Dr.
among
Cameron, I
girls.
can't. I mean, listen, but there has not been a doubling in the number of LGBT people. There simply hasn't. I think maybe we could say, because our audience, I think maybe is not us interested in us so much getting caught up in what you claim the numbers to be.
Sure.
Let's just assume for a moment that there's been a modest increase in the number of people who say they are LGBT, and I would attribute the majority of that simply to openness to admitting that because society has destigmatized it. The thing I really want to get to, which is a lot of what you sent me, is that you believe that this actually imperils Homo sapiens on the basis of reduced rates of reproduction. Do you think at some point homosexuality is going to cause Homo sapiens to die out?
It's possible. Now, I don't know. We're a rational people. We're fairly rational, that is, at least. And maybe, just maybe, if the alarm is sounded, if people see the total fertility rate declining precipitously, if they see more and more of their children going into trannyism or homosexuality,
Sorry,
they will be
I
concerned enough to
apologize.
do something.
What's trannyism? What's trannyism?
That's the notion that somehow you're in the wrong body, that you have been misplaced biologically, that you're psychologically really a girl, even though you're physiologically and biologically a male. And
why would people choose,
why,
as you say, why would people choose to go into that? Like, what benefits would it confer? It seems, in fact, to be extraordinarily difficult, both societally and medically, to do that. Why is that something somebody would choose?
Interestingly, the media has had a lot to do with this, and of course, activists, the tranny activists that had a great deal to do with this. Our society is complex. People who live in it are always looking for reasons why they're not famous or interesting, or people aren't paying enough attention to them, or aren't just interested in what they have to say and do. And I'm afraid there we have an incredibly documentable increase, something from around 1 or 2 out of 10,000 perhaps in the 1980s to something approximating almost 2%, according to the latest CDC poll of high school students.
Well, you're
That's
misstating the poll. The poll that's not 2% of people believe that they are transgender. But I think the interesting thing you mentioned is you said that sometimes people are looking for ways to get famous. How many famous transgender people do you know of, or could you name?
well, starting out with Renee Richards, I guess in the 80s, as I recall. And of course, yeah, we have this fellow Bruce Jenner, who's supposedly changing or whatever. What is
Yeah.
it, Caitlyn now? Had his own TV program and so forth. Apparently, our children, our high schoolers, are unusually susceptible to what they see on TV, what they're taught in school, and if they go to college or university, all this
Yeah, but Dr.
choose
Cameron,
your
let's
gender
if we
name,
can,
choose your pronouns is having
let's
a
stick to
profound
one
effect.
issue at a time if we can. You cited
Okay.
the idea of being famous as making transgenderism appealing. I asked you for some names. You went back to 1980, which is 40 years ago, named two people,
Uh-huh.
one of whom, hold on, one of whom was famous long before they transitioned. So that doesn't seem like a very effective way to get famous, does it?
Well, I don't know about famous, but to give one a life course, to give one a reason to get up in the morning, to give one a special attention anywhere you go,
Different argument.
generally speaking, if you're a transsexual, um, you get attention. Now, it may or may not be positive, but you're noticed and people talk about you and people look at you.
Okay, but your first
It's,
argument related to being famous, and now you're simply saying it attracts attention in public. But I want so there are these interesting offshoots which kind of give us insight into your perspective. But I want to go back to what you said before, which is it's possible that the rate of LGBT membership in Homo sapiens could possibly, was the word you used, cause the species to die out.
yes.
Homosexuality exists in hundreds or thousands of species, and the percentage species that don't have culture in the way that humans do, and it has not
Mhm.
had an impact on that the ability of that species to continue, to persist, to replicate. We're not even close mathematically, even remotely, to a percentage of LGBT membership that would even remotely imperil Homo sapiens, particularly compared to the impact that climate change, decreased male sperm count, and so many other issues could potentially have. It seems that is completely without any scientific basis to suggest that.
Well, it's not a question of scientific basis. It's a question of things are changing, which things that are changing are having the most profound effect, and theoretically, which could. For instance, in our survey we conducted in the early 80s, we found that the LBGs, there were no T's then, as you'll recall, um, reproduced at about a total fertility rate of around zero point 0.6. You need about 2.1 to maintain the species. In the aggregate, depending on whose total fertility rate you take, and it varies somewhat even between governmental agencies, much less others who have independently tried to calculate it, somewhere between 1.87 perhaps to 1.77 right now for the United States. For Europe, it's about 1.5 and has been staying fairly stable there for the last few years. Generally speaking, across the world, there is a decrement, especially in what we might call Western civilization, in the total fertility rate. And whatever mistakes seem to be made in projections, all are to the leeward side. That is, people seem to be underproducing compared to what we think they ought to be, given how they respond to questionnaires and previous kinds of fertility rates. Fertility is more delicate than we have in the past imagined. Remember, Adenauer in 1962 said, I'm not going to worry about this, there'll always be children. Well, that's not necessarily so. When he said that, the fertility rate for Europe was close to 2.1. Now it's about 1.5. Now that takes the whole aggregate. It's a somewhat different aggregate and the like. But as China has demonstrated, you mess with this for about 40 years or so, and we accommodate that. Humans learn to not be as interested in having multiple children or even children.
Dr. Cameron,
And China
we're
now is
getting
looking at
so
a
off track
demographic.
here. We're getting so off track. The focus I was hoping would be the idea
Yes.
that a modest increase, for example, from 3.8 to 4.5% of the population being LGBT simply
Mm-hmm.
cannot mathematically make it so that it is responsible for making Homo sapiens potentially die out. I mean, it simply is mathematically impossible, and it also culturally doesn't make any sense. When you think about a Darwinian adaptation and you consider that homosexuality exists in hundreds and thousands of species, we're talking about group level adaptations. Yes, an individual gay person or lesbian person is mathematically far less likely to reproduce. But as a percentage, as part of a group, as part of a society which has had LGBT people for a very, very long time, whether or not they identified that way, there is no mathematical basis for your assertion. And what China does with a one-child policy or whatever is not relevant to that.
I disagree with you. First of all, I'm not saying this is the only factor. Obviously, we're in a long-term fertility decline, and it would not take very many people going over to LGBT, if you would, to dramatically affect how many children are in the next generation. The one thing we can say for sure is that unlike, say, global warming or whatever, whoever is crawling on our rugs today definitely is going to shape the future for tomorrow. So we're in a situation right now where even an incremental increase in kids who decide to go into childless, essentially, lifestyles are going to impact our society.
Dr. Cameron, that
And
also ignores the fact that many people who aren't LGBT don't have kids. The idea that the next generation is so highly sensitive only to whether LGBT individuals are or aren't having kids ignores the fact that the sensitivity to that is much lower than you would suggest, because many people not part of the LGBT community also don't have children, and you admit that that's happening across multiple cultures and in multiple countries. But I think that
yeah,
I
let
think
me
the
go back
audience
to
sort of
one point that you
understands
made.
your position on
Yeah,
that.
all right, let's go back. You've brought up twice that you think that many species have homosexuality.
I don't think
I
that's
disagree.
just the truth.
No, it is not just the truth. Homosexuality among humans is very different than homosexuality in any other context.
Well, you need it to be
What other
different.
species
The
do
people on your
with, say,
side need to
same
demonstrate that
sex?
it's different, because otherwise you lose the argument that people are being convinced to be gay. That it's not actually different.
Uh, on the contrary, if you look at what animals do, let's take our own genus, and you look at what other animals do, it looks like homosexuality. Sometimes it involves sex. Sometimes it just, in the case of penguins, sitting together on eggs or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Homosexuality to humans is pretty specific. It is, after all, knowing that there are the opposite sex available and choosing the same sex. It's looking for sexual encounters, and it's often closing off the possibility of sexual encounters with the opposite sex. Obviously, like in our survey, and I think it's the only one that's actually done an index of how many kids each LBG claimed to have, 0.6 is way below replacement level. The more that grows, the more it's going to influence a declining total fertility rate.
But Dr. Cameron, you're all over the map with different arguments.
Back to your point.
It's a fallacious
Animals,
point. Dr. Cameron, hold on a second. You could make the case that whatever is different for humans, because humans are unique. You could say child rearing. It might look like there are thousands of species that do child rearing, but it's different for humans. Of course it is. Humans are different. And your argument now is to say that human homosexuality is different than any other homosexuality merely because humans are human. You could apply that to anything, but it doesn't refute the argument that you're trying to refute.
I don't think that's true.
I know.
First of all, you can't interview the animals. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what their choices are. And
these are unfalsifiable. But this is not science, Dr. Cameron. Dr. Cameron,
claims.
this is no longer science.
I don't think there's any science on the homosexuality of other animals.
There is. You probably just don't like it.
No, I don't care.
Dr. Cameron, the argument you're making is actual scientists would say you're creating indefeasible arguments. It's sort of like saying, I don't care whether people say they are atheists because deep down they actually are religious. They just don't even know it. These are the types of things that are outside the realm of science because they're unfalsifiable. You can't ask a dog whether they're actually gay or just behaving in a way that is indicative. I mean, this is not science.
I'm sorry, it is science. That's why it's to extrapolate human homosexuality or human marriage to animals is, I think, silly.
Yes,
animals
marriage is a contract. Marriage is a contract, and it's something else.
Animal behavior has no bearing on how we ought to run our society. Our society is, as we are now demonstrating, far more delicate than we think. You're a representative of a group that's saying, hey, we can have as many people as want to engage in homosexuality. It's not going to hurt us. We're going to fantasize or postulate that it's kind of inborn. People are naturally responding to whatever they're finding in themselves. I'm saying none at all. That as a matter of fact, we are social animals. We are social humans. And as such, we are very susceptible, apparently, in our society to the entertainment media, what we see on TV, what we see on movies, and who gets attention. There are, I don't think, but maybe there are, more disturbed, more distressed children today. And more of those seem to be opting for LBGTism.
Okay, I mean, this is just, this is a line. This is a complete disconnect from any, I mean, what you're saying is just now so off the charts that it's sort of like a Gish Gallop about choosing and all of these different things. Let's see if we can, because I think now it's very clear to our audience sort of where you stand on this stuff. Here's what I want to kind of get to big picture with you as we're getting now into the latter part of this interview. What is it like, given that you have been working on this issue for so long? As I said, you are one of the most well-known sort of anti-gay people, I would say, in American society over the last many decades. Is it sad to see that gay marriage is now legal all over the country, that more and more states are making it illegal to fire people because of their perceived or actual sexual orientation? As we learn more and more about same-sex adoption, we see that the outcomes are just as good as with opposite sex couples. Hold on a second, Dr. Kemp. Hold on a second. Whoa, hold on. Let's back up. Let's back up here. I knew that one would set you off. We can focus in on the adoption in a second, but is it sad for you to see that after decades of doing this, that things are clearly, you're losing this battle very clearly?
It's personally distressing, disappointing. On the other hand, I'm here because I feel that I speak for the truth. And eventually, and I'm afraid that our society is proving it, you mess with homosexuality, you're messing with something that's far more potent than you imagine. You may like the idea that, hey, people say I'm equal to you because, well, I have sex and I enjoy it and I like it with more guys, but and I don't have it with girls or seldom with girls or whatever. And that's fair. That's reasonable. Well, it isn't fair and reasonable if you want to continue to have a society.
Okay, no, I understand the apocalyptic stuff that you say. I get that you're saying this apocalyptic stuff. But my question was, do
It
you
is
feel that you've
apocalyptic.
lost? Do you feel
We're
that
the
you've
beginnings
lost?
of an apocalypse.
It is apocalypse. Okay, yeah, that's feel that. So
I
listen,
agree.
you told me in one
You,
of our previous interviews that when you were young, you actually had a period during which you experienced some attractions to men. I believe it was one or a couple older men. Does this ring a bell from one of our old interviews?
no, you're misrepresenting it. I said I was 3 years old and I was raped by either a teenager or a young man. And at the time, as I thought about it, I said, as a 3 year old, I could see where this might catch on. Fortunately for me, it never happened again. Had it happened again, I don't know. I was three. Three is, I remember some things from being three. Perhaps you do. But most of the stuff I remember is not sexual. But I do remember that sexual event, and it was something that impressed itself on me.
And is that partially responsible for your position on gay adoption today, something you are so vehemently against?
I don't think so, but as I've done research, and as you may well be aware, we've been doing research now into Google child sexual abuse on Google News. We've collected an enormous chunk of every single story that Google presented. For instance, between 2012 and 2014, here in the United States, child sexual abuse as indexed by Google. Hey, if you can't believe Google, who can you believe? In the United States, about half of all the child victims are victims of homosexuals. In the UK, it's running at about 75%.
Okay,
And
Dr.
this has been
Cameron,
very,
I
very
have to
stable.
interrupt. I'm sorry. I
So
have to
I
interrupt.
relate.
I have to interrupt
Yes.
because you are this is literal nonsense. I mean, there's a couple things that are just being completely misstated by you. Number one, we know that when it comes to pedophilia, it is not an act that is sexual in terms of heterosexual or homosexual. It is often based on hold on a
You don't
second.
know what you
It's
don't know
based on
that. You're
availability.
talking
If you're
psychobabble. Hey,
attracted to
I'm talking as an
prepubescent
actual
kids,
empirical scientist.
no,
You're
you're
talking
actually not. And
psychobabble.
the anything that is
No,
based on
that's
Google
psychobabble.
articles,
What a
what
bunch
is
of crap.
reported on
The
Google, Dr.
person who
Cameron,
raped me
Dr.
and
Cameron, hold on a
sir,
second here.
the
Hold on a
person
second.
who raped me enjoyed homosexuality. He knew what he was doing.
Dr.
I
Cameron,
didn't know what he was doing.
any analysis of the frequency of a phenomena on the basis of the frequency with which the media reports on it is going to be skewed by how interesting it is to report on it for media. And that is not a serious way to determine the frequency of an event.
Okay, I would disagree with you in general that, first of all, I agree. The media does what's interesting, what they think will get attention. However, for instance, when it comes to, say, clerics, what we found is that Baptists, across all these surveys that we've done, who are clerics who do molestations, only about 43% of the perpetrators are engaged in homosexuality with children, whereas with Roman Catholic priests, it's somewhere in the vicinity of high 80s, low 90s, depending on the situation and the culture. Now, here, there's no reason at all why, given the hostility generally to religion by the press, always interested in highlighting hypocrisy and nastiness on their part. What we found is this across, as near as we can tell, every society that uses English, and even those societies that use Chinese and Polish and Italian and so forth. Protestant ministers tend more frequently to molest girls, and Catholic priests in every society that we've been able to index for a reasonable length of time are after boys. Now, I would say not that homosexual, that they're people who engage in sex with children are pedophiliacs. Bull. They are engaging in sex with children. They do it because they like it. Almost all of them also engage with men
Dr.
if
Cameron,
they're
I just can't allow this
homosexual,
to go
and
on.
with
This has
women
been,
if they're
we're going back 20
heterosexual in their
years. I mean, this has been so
predations on
widely
children.
debunked that I can't even, my audience is just so beyond this. You know, I was really hoping to hear from you, your honest feelings about how your movement is losing. It's losing every year. It's losing ground as LGBT
Yes,
individuals.
in our
And that's what I was
societies,
most interested in
total
hearing about, not
fertility rate
debunked
is
nonsense that's not
declining.
even science.
Well, you can say what science is: the collection of and theorizing about piles of data of varying sorts. That's what science is. Now, if we have an enormous pile of data collected from Google, when we tried to collect it ourselves, we were always open to the charge, well, you're maybe biased in what you're looking for or looking at. Maybe you ignore certain stories and
Oh,
so
man.
forth. Now, we found a general consistency, and I'm pointing out one of them. Or look at school teachers. Likewise, among those elementary teachers who molest children, and again, I'm going to stick with Google News, the amount of children that each perpetrator reaches is about the same for heterosexual as well as homosexual molesters. But once you get to the secondary level, high school, suddenly there is about a doubling of the number of students who are molested by the homosexually inclined versus those heterosexually.
Dr. Cameron, I'm sorry. I have to cut this. I have to cut this off. This is like deciding which dogs are more dangerous based on which dogs are more written about as being involved in bites. I mean, it's the most wide. I can't believe that someone who claims to be a man of science like you in 2019 is still doing this stuff. And unfortunately, because of the filibustering on this stuff, we're at the end of our time. And I was hoping to really be able to dig in with you more about how you're feeling about everything that has taken place rather than the time. I mean, I was arguing about this stuff with you 10 years ago when it didn't make sense then, and it still doesn't make sense now, but it seems as though we've been unable to move past it.
It does make sense now. For instance, as we've gathered data, how do you account for this? Doing the same thing in Mandarin for China, we have a pretty good sample, 200 consecutive cases of molestation, according to Google, in Mandarin. And China, which is far more accepting of LGBTism, only about 5%
Dr.
of their
Cameron,
children.
China is not accepting of LGBTism, and China has a completely closed, suppressed media state. And the idea of Googling China news in order to ascertain anything about that society is one of the silliest things that anyone can do. Listen, Dr.
Well, you
Cameron,
can say it's silly. If you go to Taiwan, and we've gone to Taiwan by using the Taiwanese dialect and doing the same thing, it ticks up. Okay. And we've also done it in Russia, we've done it in Poland, we've done it in Italy, and the consistency between, for instance, the Pew survey of people and how, let's say, favorably inclined they are to homosexuality, and the proportion of their children who are molested, according to Google, which are homosexually molested, it's about 0.7, 0.8. It's a very decent correlation.
Dr. Cameron, I think we get it. I think we get the perspective.
The more you accept homosexuality,
we are just way over time. Dr. Cameron, Dr. Paul Cameron, chairman of the Family Research Institute. I'm sorry we weren't able to have the type of conversation I wanted. And we're going back to the same tired arguments, but I think at least we've been able to confirm you're still up to the same stuff. You're still up to the same stuff. And we appreciate Dr. Paul Cameron joining us today.